My daughter said I was embarrassing at parent night, and I made her spend a week doing my job to understand why. Sophia whispered it loud enough for 3 other parents to hear. Mom, you smell. Why did you have to come straight from work? We were standing in the hallway of Riverside High School during junior year parent night, surrounded by other families dressed in business casual and expensive perfume. I was wearing my city sanitation uniform, forest green with reflective strips, and yes, I probably smelled like the 8 hours I'd just spent collecting garbage in 90-degree heat. I'd come straight from my route because parent night started at 6 o'clock and my shift ended at 5:30, giving me exactly 20 minutes to drive across town. There wasn't time to go home and change. Sophia's face was red, her eyes darting to see who was watching. Her friends stood a few feet away, whispering behind their hands. I kept my voice low and said I was sorry, but this was the only way I could make it. She said I should have just stayed home, that her friend Brooke's mom was a lawyer and didn't show up smelling like trash. The words hit exactly where she intended. I'd been a sanitation worker for the city of Riverside for 14 years, ever since Sophia was 3 and her father died in a construction accident. The job paid $42,000 annually with benefits and a pension, enough to keep us housed and fed in a city where rent ate half my paycheck. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work that kept the city running. Sophia stormed ahead to her classroom, leaving me standing in the hallway. I followed slowly, aware of the space other parents created around me, the subtle shift away when I got too close. I'd always known my job carried stigma, but seeing my own daughter ashamed of me in public opened a wound I didn't know existed. In Sophia's English classroom, I sat in the back while Mrs. Gallagher explained the curriculum. Sophia sat up front with her friends, never once looking back at me. When the teacher asked parents about their professions for a career discussion, I stayed silent. The lawyer mother spoke, then a software engineer father, then a dentist, a marketing executive, a real estate agent. All clean jobs, respectable jobs, jobs that didn't make their children flushed with shame. After parent night ended, Sophia and I drove home in silence. Our apartment was in a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy but safe and clean. I'd worked hard to give her stability after losing her father. She went straight to her room without saying goodnight. I stood in the shower for 20 minutes, scrubbing the smell of garbage from my skin, thinking about the contempt in my daughter's voice. The next morning, Sophia was cheerful at breakfast as if nothing had happened. She asked if I could give her money for new shoes. The ones all her friends had, $140 for sneakers with a brand name I couldn't afford. I told her we'd see, which was code for no. She rolled her eyes and said I never bought her anything good, that she was tired of being the poor kid with the trash collector mom. Something inside me snapped, not violently, but decisively. I set down my coffee mug and told her we needed to have a conversation. She checked her phone and said she had to leave for school. I told her to sit down. The tone in my voice must have registered because she actually obeyed. I said, "You think my job is embarrassing. You think I'm beneath the other parents. So next week during your spring break, you're going to spend every day with me on my route. You're going to do my job and understand exactly why I come home smelling the way I do." Sophia's face went pale. She said there was no way she was spending her break picking up trash. I told her it wasn't a request. She could come with me and learn, or she could lose her phone, her laptop, and every privilege she'd taken for granted. Her choice. Sophia protested loudly, saying it was child abuse to make her work during her vacation. I reminded her that at 16, she was old enough to have a work permit, and many teenagers her age already had jobs. This would be educational. She appealed to sympathy, saying her friends would mock her if they found out. I said, "Welcome to my world." She tried anger, slamming her bedroom door so hard a picture fell off the wall. I let her rage. By Sunday night before spring break started, Sophia had resigned herself to the inevitable. I'd already cleared it with my supervisor, a man named Vernon Briggs who'd been with the city for 30 years. Vernon thought it was a good idea, said maybe more kids should see what their parents actually did for a living. He agreed to let Sophia shadow me for the week, with the understanding she'd do actual work, not just observe. That night, I made Sophia set an alarm for 4:30 a.m. She looked at me in horror and said school didn't even start until 7:45. I told her my shift started at 6 o'clock, which meant leaving the house by 5:15 to get to the city sanitation depot. She asked why so early. I explained garbage collection happened before most people woke up so they didn't have to see us or smell us. The irony seemed lost on her. Monday morning, I dragged Sophia out of bed at 4:30. She moved through the dark apartment in a daze, pulling on old clothes I'd told her to wear, nothing she cared about because it would be destroyed by the end of the week. We drove through empty streets to the sanitation depot on the industrial side of town. The facility was a sprawling compound of garage bays, dumpsters, and garbage trucks in various states of maintenance. The smell hit Sophia before we even parked. Rotting waste, diesel fuel, and something chemical I'd never been able to identify. She gagged and asked if we could leave. I said we'd just arrived. Inside the depot, I clocked in and introduced Sophia to my crew. My partner for the past 6 years was a woman named Deshawn Harper, built solid from years of lifting heavy loads, with a no-nonsense attitude that had saved me more than once. Deshawn looked Sophia up and down and said, "Your mama says you think her job is embarrassing. Let's see how you feel after today." Sophia didn't respond. We got our route assignment from Vernon, then headed to our truck, a massive rear-loading compactor that held 20 tons of garbage when full. Deshawn drove while I rode on the back, which is where Sophia would be working too. I explained the job simply. When we stopped at a residence, she'd run to the curb, grab the trash can, wheel it to the truck, dump it into the hopper, then return the empty can. She'd do this for approximately 800 homes over an 8-hour shift. Sophia's eyes widened at the number. I told her that was a light day. Some routes had 1,200 stops. We started in a middle-class neighborhood, houses with neat lawns and matching mailboxes. The first stop, Sophia approached the trash can hesitantly. It was overfilled, garbage bags piled on top of the closed lid. She tried to lift it and immediately dropped it, bags spilling onto the street. Deshawn called out from the driver's seat, "Pick it up, all of it. Nobody else is going to clean your mess." Sophia knelt on the asphalt, gathering garbage with her bare hands because she'd refused to wear the work gloves I'd offered. A bag broke open, spilling coffee grounds and food waste across her shoes. She made a sound of disgust but kept working because Deshawn and I were watching. By the 10th stop, Sophia was sweating. By the 50th, she was exhausted. We'd been working for 2 hours and hadn't even finished one street. I let her struggle for the first half of the route. She needed to feel it, the weight of the cans, the smell, the pace required to stay on schedule. By lunch break, her hands were blistered despite finally wearing gloves, her clothes were stained with unknown substances, and her face had gone from embarrassment to grim determination. We ate sandwiches I'd packed, sitting on the curb of a park because the truck cabin only fit 2. Sophia drank water like she'd never been hydrated before in her life. She asked how I did this every day. I told her I didn't have a choice. This job paid our rent, her school fees, her food, her phone bill, everything. She looked at her sandwich and didn't finish it. The afternoon route took us to a different neighborhood, older homes with less maintenance. Here, the garbage cans were heavier, often overflowing, sometimes filled with things that should have been disposed of properly but weren't. Broken glass, construction debris, bags of yard waste so heavy Sophia couldn't lift them alone. I helped her with those, showing her technique for leveraging weight. At one house, the homeowner came out and yelled at us for being too slow, for making noise, for existing in his space. He didn't acknowledge us as human, just as an inconvenience. Sophia watched this interaction with something that looked like shock. I'd experienced this kind of treatment thousands of times, people who viewed sanitation workers as less than, as invisible labor that should happen silently and without acknowledgement. After the man went back inside, Sophia asked if that happened a lot. I said every single day. People yelled about noise, about timing, about trash cans not being returned to the exact right spot. They complained if we were too early or too late. They left hazardous materials and regular garbage that could injure us. They treated us like we were the trash we collected. We finished the route at 3 p.m., 9 hours after starting. Sophia could barely walk to the car. Her entire body ached from repetitive lifting and running. Her hands were raw despite the gloves. Her clothes were ruined. She smelled exactly how I smelled every day. On the drive home, she asked if I was trying to punish her. I said no, I was trying to educate her. She'd called me embarrassing for doing honest work that paid our bills. Now she understood what that work actually entailed. She was quiet the rest of the drive. That night, Sophia couldn't lift her arms above her shoulders. She took a long shower and went to bed at 7 p.m. without dinner. Day 2 started the same. 4:30 a.m. wake up, Sophia moving even slower due to muscle soreness. At the depot, Vernon pulled me aside and said he'd gotten a complaint. Someone had reported seeing a teenager working on a sanitation truck, asking if it was legal. I told him Sophia was shadowing me for educational purposes with his permission. Vernon said he'd backed me up, but to be careful. The city didn't like attention on the sanitation department. I asked why that was. Vernon's expression darkened and he said, because if people look too close, they'd see things the city doesn't want them to see. Before I could ask what he meant, Deshawn called that we needed to roll. Today's route included commercial properties, restaurants, and businesses. The dumpsters here were enormous, requiring the truck's hydraulic lift to empty them. But first, someone had to move them into position, and that was often difficult because businesses overfilled them or blocked them with other debris. At our first restaurant stop, Sophia and I worked together to move a dumpster that weighed several hundred pounds even before the garbage. As we positioned it, I noticed something wrong. The dumpster was filled with more than food waste. There were chemical containers, paint cans, and what looked like industrial solvents. This wasn't regular garbage. This was hazardous waste that required special disposal. I told Deshawn to hold up before dumping it. She came back to look and swore under her breath. This was a violation that could contaminate the entire load, making it hazardous waste instead of regular garbage. That meant expensive special disposal and potential fines. But more than that, it meant whoever dumped these chemicals knew they were breaking the law and did it anyway because proper disposal cost money. I took photos of the dumpster contents and the business name. Sophia asked what we were supposed to do. Deshawn said what we always did, report it to the supervisor and let the city handle it. I'd filed at least 30 reports about illegal dumping in the past 2 years. Nothing ever happened. The businesses got verbal warnings at most. We carefully separated the hazardous containers and loaded the regular waste. I set the chemical containers aside for special pickup, knowing that would probably cost the city extra because the business wouldn't be billed properly. Sophia asked why the restaurant wasn't punished. I explained that enforcement was complicated, that businesses had lawyers and made campaign contributions. Sanitation workers had neither. At our next stop, a manufacturing facility, we found the same problem. Hazardous materials mixed with regular trash. Again, we separated and documented. Again, I knew nothing would happen. By lunch, Sophia had seen 4 violations. She asked if this was normal. Deshawn laughed bitterly and said this was a good day. Some routes had a dozen violations. Some businesses dumped medical waste, chemical waste, even radioactive materials from certain manufacturing processes, all mixed in with regular garbage to avoid disposal fees. If we didn't catch it and separate it out, it ended up in the landfill, leaching into the groundwater, creating environmental disasters that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Sophia asked why nobody stopped it. I said I'd been asking the same question for years. That afternoon, our route took us through an industrial park where a chemical manufacturing plant operated. The dumpsters here were massive, and as we approached, I smelled something wrong. Not regular garbage smell, but something sharp and acrid that made my eyes water. I told Sophia to stay back and approached carefully. Inside the dumpster were dozens of drums, each labeled with hazard warnings. Toxic chemicals, corrosive materials, substances that required specialized disposal by law. This company was dumping thousands of dollars worth of hazardous waste into regular garbage to avoid proper disposal costs. This wasn't a small violation. This was criminal. I took extensive photos and videos documenting every drum, every label. Deshawn called Vernon at the depot and explained what we'd found. Vernon told us not to touch it, to leave the dumpster and move on to the next stop. He'd handle reporting it. I asked if he was sure, and Vernon said yes, just leave it. Something in his voice sounded defeated. We continued our route, but I couldn't stop thinking about those drums. That amount of toxic waste in a landfill could poison the water supply for thousands of people. Children could get sick. People could develop cancers. This wasn't just about illegal dumping. This was about public health. When we returned to the depot at end of shift, I asked Vernon what happened with the report. He said he'd filed it with the city's environmental compliance office. I asked what they would do. Vernon looked around to make sure nobody was listening, then told Sophia and me to come into his office. He closed the door and sat down heavily. He said, "I'm going to tell you something I shouldn't tell you, but you need to know. The city's environmental compliance office doesn't enforce anything against major businesses. They can't. Those businesses are the city's largest taxpayers. They make donations to city council members. They employ hundreds of people. So when we file reports about illegal dumping, those reports get filed away and nothing happens." I asked how long this had been going on. Vernon said at least 10 years that he knew of, probably longer. He said multiple sanitation workers had tried to escalate complaints, going to the media, to state environmental agencies, to anyone who would listen. Those workers got reassigned to worse routes, written up for minor infractions, or pushed out entirely. The message was clear: don't make waves. I asked if he had proof of the retaliation. Vernon pulled out a file from his locked desk drawer. Inside were documented cases of 6 different sanitation workers who'd reported major environmental violations and subsequently faced disciplinary actions or forced resignations. One worker had tried to go to the newspaper and been fired the same week for allegedly falsifying his time card, despite having worked for the city for 15 years without any prior issues. Another worker had contacted the State Environmental Protection Agency and found herself reassigned to a route that required driving a malfunctioning truck without proper repairs, creating a safety hazard that eventually resulted in an accident. The pattern was unmistakable. Whistleblowers got destroyed. Vernon said he'd kept these files as insurance but hadn't known what to do with them. He was 3 years from retirement and couldn't afford to lose his pension. I understood. I was 14 years in with a daughter depending on me. Sophia had been silent during this conversation, taking in information that clearly shocked her. She asked Vernon why the city would let this happen. Vernon said, "Because holding businesses accountable costs money and political capital. It's easier to let them dump illegally and pretend not to notice. The consequences won't show up for years, maybe decades. By then, the current officials will be long gone and someone else will deal with the cancer clusters and poisoned water." On the drive home, Sophia asked if I'd known about all of this. I said I'd known my individual reports went nowhere, but I hadn't understood the scope of the cover-up until Vernon explained it. I'd thought it was bureaucratic incompetence, not systemic corruption. Sophia asked what we were going to do. I said I didn't know yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those chemical drums, about years of toxic waste being dumped in the landfill, about the communities near that landfill who had no idea what they were being exposed to, about my own complicity in the system because I'd continued working, continued dumping, continued reporting violations that I knew would be ignored. In the morning, day 3, Sophia was already awake when I went to wake her. She said she'd been thinking about what Vernon told us. She asked if I had copies of my own reports. I did, years of documentation on my personal laptop. Sophia said she wanted to look at them. After our shift that day, we sat at our kitchen table and reviewed every report I'd filed. 38 documented cases of illegal dumping over 2 years. Hazardous chemicals, medical waste, industrial toxins, all photographed and reported. Every single report had been marked resolved in the city's system, But I knew for a fact nothing had been resolved. The same businesses were still dumping illegally because I saw it every week. Sophia asked if she could have copies of everything. I asked why. She said, "Because you're scared to take this public. You have a job to protect. But I'm 16. I don't work for the city. I can make noise." I started to say no, that it was too dangerous, that she could face retaliation too. She cut me off and said, "Mom, you came to my parent night directly from work because you couldn't afford to take time off. You've spent 14 years doing backbreaking labor so I could have a stable life. I embarrassed you because I didn't understand what you sacrificed. Now I understand. And I'm not going to let the city keep treating you and all the other workers this way. Let me do this." Her determination reminded me of her father, who'd fought for better safety conditions on his construction site before the accident that killed him. I wondered if this was genetic, this need to fight injustice even when it was dangerous. I gave Sophia copies of everything I had. She spent the next evening organizing the documents, creating a comprehensive file that showed the pattern of illegal dumping and non-enforcement. Then she did something I didn't expect. She contacted local news stations. Within 24 hours, she had 3 reporters interested in the story. One reporter, a woman named Leslie Choi from the regional investigative team, came to our apartment to review the evidence. Leslie was in her 30s, with a reputation for exposing government corruption. She looked through the files carefully, asking detailed questions about the city's environmental compliance office, about Vernon's documentation of retaliation, about the specific businesses involved. She asked if I was willing to go on camera. I hesitated. Going public meant risking my job, my pension, everything I'd worked for. Leslie saw my fear and said, "I understand. Let me investigate independently first. If I can corroborate your reports with my own evidence, you won't have to be the face of this story." That gave me some relief. Leslie left with copies of everything and promised to be in touch. Day 4 of Sophia's week with me was different. Word had spread at the depot that a reporter was asking questions. Vernon pulled me aside and asked if I'd talk to the media. I said a reporter had contacted me, but I hadn't initiated it. Vernon looked worried and said, "Be careful. The city doesn't respond well to this kind of attention." On our route that day, Deshawn was quiet. Finally, she said, "You know this is going to blow back on us. The city will circle wagons. We'll be the ones who suffer." I said I knew, but I couldn't keep silent anymore. Deshawn asked if it was worth losing my job over. I said I didn't know, but I knew staying silent while people got poisoned wasn't something I could live with. We found another violation that day, a medical clinic dumping biohazardous waste in a regular dumpster, used needles, blood-contaminated materials, all mixed with regular trash. This was a direct threat to sanitation workers who could get stuck by needles and exposed to bloodborne pathogens. I documented it thoroughly. Sophia watched me and said, "This has to stop." 2 days later, Leslie Choi's investigation aired. The segment was 15 minutes long, detailing years of illegal dumping by major corporations, showing photos and videos from my reports, explaining how the city's environmental compliance office had failed to enforce violations. Leslie had done her own stakeouts at several businesses, catching them in the act of dumping hazardous materials. She interviewed anonymous sources from the Environmental Compliance Office, who confirmed that business complaints were systematically ignored due to political pressure. She showed the pattern of retaliation against sanitation workers who tried to report problems. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Social media erupted with outrage. Environmental groups demanded investigations. The state attorney general's office announced they were launching a criminal probe into the city's handling of hazardous waste. The mayor held a press conference claiming he'd been unaware of the situation and would take immediate action. By the end of the day, the director of the city's environmental compliance office had been placed on administrative leave. But the backlash hit us too. The next morning when I arrived at the depot, Vernon called me into his office. His face was grim. He said the city manager wanted to see me that afternoon, and I should bring a union representative. I asked if I was being fired. Vernon said he didn't know, but to prepare for the worst. The meeting was at 2 p.m. at City Hall. I brought my union rep, a man named Kevin Wu who'd handled dozens of cases over his career. In the city manager's office, we sat across from 3 people: the city manager, Roger Finley, the city attorney, and the human resources director. Finley got straight to the point. He said my leak of confidential reports to the media had violated city policy and damaged the city's reputation. They were considering termination. Kevin Wu stepped in immediately, saying the reports weren't confidential. They were public records about public health violations. He said I had whistleblower protections under state law. The city attorney countered that I'd violated the chain of command by going to the media instead of following proper procedures. Kevin pointed out that I'd followed proper procedures for 2 years and nothing happened. The back and forth continued for 30 minutes. Finally, Finley said they weren't firing me yet, but I was being reassigned to a different route and would face a formal review in 30 days. It was a temporary solution that satisfied nobody. Outside City Hall, Kevin told me to document everything, every interaction with supervisors, every assignment, every conversation. If they tried to push me out, we'd have a retaliation case. I drove home feeling exhausted and scared. Sophia was waiting for me. She'd seen the news coverage of the Attorney General's investigation. She asked if I was okay. I told her about the meeting, about the threat of termination. Her face crumpled and she said she was sorry, that she'd made everything worse. I pulled her into a hug and said she'd done nothing wrong. She'd exposed something that needed exposing. The consequences weren't her fault. They were the fault of the people who'd allowed the corruption to continue for years. Over the next week, day 5 through 7 of what was supposed to be Sophia's spring break with me, things moved quickly. The state attorney general's investigation expanded to include multiple cities. Investigators interviewed dozens of sanitation workers who'd witnessed illegal dumping. Several businesses were raided, with investigators seizing records and equipment. The chemical manufacturing plant that had dumped the toxic drums was shut down pending criminal charges. Environmental tests of the landfill showed contamination levels far exceeding safe limits. The groundwater near the landfill was poisoned. Nearby residents were offered free health screenings. 3 children had elevated blood lead levels. 2 adults had symptoms consistent with chemical exposure. The scope of harm was staggering. Sophia finished her week working with me on day 7. She'd lost 8 pounds from the physical labor. Her hands had calluses. She understood viscerally what my job required, but more than that, she understood why it mattered. We weren't just collecting garbage. We were the first line of defense against corporations poisoning their communities. When we ignored violations or let ourselves be silenced, people died. On her last day, we worked the same middle-class neighborhood where we'd started. At one house, a woman came out to thank us. She said she'd seen the news coverage and never realized what sanitation workers dealt with. She said we deserved better. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything. Sophia thanked her back and said her mom was a hero. 2 weeks after the news broke, the city settled with me and the union. No termination, no formal discipline, and protections against future retaliation written into my contract. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was something. The Attorney General's office filed criminal charges against 6 businesses and 4 city officials, including the Director of Environmental Compliance and 2 city council members who'd taken campaign donations from companies with dumping violations. The mayor, facing recall threats, announced sweeping reforms to environmental enforcement. A new independent oversight board was created with real enforcement power. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. The settlement also included provisions for all sanitation workers to receive hazard pay for routes with illegal dumping violations, proper protective equipment, and mandatory training on identifying and reporting environmental crimes. Our base pay increased by $8,000 annually. It didn't compensate for years of exposure to toxic materials, but it was acknowledgement that our work had value. Sophia returned to school after spring break completely changed. Her friends asked where she'd been, why she wasn't answering texts. She told them she'd spent the week working on a garbage truck with her mom. Some friends laughed. Some thought she was joking. When they realized she was serious, the reaction split. Some friends distanced themselves, unable to reconcile their image of Sophia with someone who'd voluntarily collected trash. But others were curious, asking questions about what she'd discovered, about the environmental investigation. Sophia started talking more openly about labor issues, about environmental justice, about the disconnect between people who benefited from services and the people who provided those services. She joined the school's environmental club and started a campaign to reduce waste in the cafeteria. She organized a fundraiser for families affected by the contaminated groundwater near the landfill. Her teachers noticed the change. One told me at a parent conference that Sophia had matured remarkably, that she showed leadership and social consciousness that hadn't been there before. I said she'd learned some hard lessons. The teacher said they were lessons more students needed to learn. 6 months later, the trials for the city officials and business owners began. Sophia and I attended several days of testimony. Watching the defendants squirm under cross-examination, seeing them held accountable for years of deliberate negligence, provided a satisfaction I hadn't expected. The environmental compliance director received 4 years in prison for accepting bribes. 2 council members received 3 years each for corruption and conspiracy. The business owners faced steeper sentences, some receiving up to 10 years for criminal environmental violations that had resulted in documentable health harm. Their companies were fined millions of dollars, money that would fund cleanup and medical monitoring for affected residents. The judge, during sentencing, spoke directly to the importance of environmental enforcement and the role of workers who put their safety at risk to protect communities. She acknowledged that sanitation workers were often treated as invisible, their concerns dismissed, their reports ignored. She said that had to change. On the anniversary of parent night that had started everything, I attended again. This time I arrived in clean clothes, having taken the afternoon off work specifically to attend. Sophia met me in the hallway and hugged me tightly. No embarrassment, no shame. She introduced me to new friends and told them proudly that her mom was a sanitation worker who'd helped expose one of the biggest environmental corruption cases in state history. A few teachers approached me saying they'd followed the case and were impressed by my courage. The principal asked if I'd be willing to speak at a career day about my work. I agreed. When we left that night, walking through the parking lot to my car, Sophia said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." I told her that understanding often required experience, and now she had both. 3 years later, Sophia graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to study environmental science. At her graduation party, she gave a speech thanking me for showing her what real work meant, what real courage looked like, and what it meant to fight for what was right even when it was dangerous. She said the week she'd spent collecting garbage had changed the trajectory of her life. She'd gone from being a privileged teenager who looked down on her mother's profession to someone who understood that every job had dignity, every worker deserved respect, and environmental justice was everybody's responsibility. Now, she manages a statewide program investigating illegal dumping and advocating for sanitation workers' rights. She makes more money than I ever did, but she tells people constantly that her mother, who collected garbage for 20 years, taught her everything important she knows. I'm still working for the city, same job, better protections. The work is still hard, still physically demanding, still requires getting up at 4:30 a.m. But I do it with pride now, knowing my daughter understands what I do and why it matters. Last week, Sophia called to say she'd just won a major lawsuit against a corporation dumping toxic waste in a low-income neighborhood. She said, "This is your legacy, Mom. Every time I win one of these cases, I think about you reporting violations for years while nobody listened. You taught me that speaking up matters, even when people don't want to hear it." That's all I ever wanted. For my daughter to understand that embarrassment had nothing to do with the work itself, but with society's failure to value the people who kept it running. Now she knows, and she's teaching others. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.